Hello! This should be my second devlog into projects I've worked on independently. This project is just a kind of untitled game I've worked on. I'll just be keeping it untitled because there's a chance I continue trying to work on this in the future. The main reason, and what I'm going to be showcasing today, is the unfinished nature of this game. It is unfinished for reasons of, that is, say, most game developers, scope creep. The scope for this game was bigger than I should have let it be, and I had to create a lot of systems from scratch for what I wanted, and eventually I just kind of got burned out and stopped working on it. So what this will be is reviewing all of those systems I created, because I'm still quite happy with them, and really showcasing what I've made by myself, and with some assistance from YouTube tutorials and stuff like that. But I mean, everyone gets aid from that for game dev. But still, all of this was put together myself. First thing of those functional systems I will be explaining is the... well, first of all, let me show you how the game plays. Not very much. The camera follows the player. You see as it's kind of follows and then stops at bounds. And then swaps between quote-unquote rooms. We're about to talk about that. You can swing. The little PNG there is just to show the hitbox. Swing on the ground. Go upstairs, you swing up. Go downstairs, you swing down. So that's how that works. You can go between things. There are ladders, so you see you can kind of walk over there once you interact. Because the green diamond is there. There's that there. That means you can interact. Go down the ladder. Stop. Go over this. Collect some health. Go past the screen. Collect some coins. And that is the extent of... you can't go above it. That is the extent of how... well, I gotta fix that, but... that is the extent of what is everything that functions in the game. Now I'm going to be explaining how all those things you saw works. Because, as is true with lots of game dev, even though all of that is very simple in concept, there's a lot more that goes in behind it. So, we'll explain that now. First, I will be explaining the custom camera movement, as you see. So this is through two main scripts. First things first, you notice all of these big collision shapes. So what these are each of the rooms. So I have collision shapes for each of these quote-unquote rooms. I have this one's disabled, as you can see. So I have a collision shape defining the boundaries for these rooms. What the script does is when something enters the area, first, it grabs the basically width and height, those bounding rectangle, essentially. It grabs in kind of defines like a shape of this rectangle and grabs how high it goes and how wide it goes. Grabs those parameters and then fills them in to match the camera limit. I'm about to explain further what that means, but then if what just entered the room is a player, tell the camera to update its camera limits to that room that was just entered. Now, how this really functions is how Godot's camera limit works. And if you notice, you see how the camera has that remote transform. It follows the player, as you can see, left and right, up and down. But once it gets to a certain point, it stops following them. I'm still moving, but it's not really following. It stops here. And then once I go past it, it updates into this room. What this effectively is the camera is not... It is moving, but what's happening is the camera the camera follows the player, and then once it gets to the end here, because of the camera limit is set to the bounds of this box, is essentially what happens. So, when something enters the room, it grabs the bounds of each of the rectangle, or of that rectangle, and the camera limit cannot go outside of this. The camera is stuck inside this box. Once the player moves out of it, the player isn't restricted like the camera is. The player can just freely go through. Like, the player freely just go through. And once they do, once the player does, the new room is recognized, and new character limits of this new room is set. So, once the player goes over, the camera is forced to abide by the new camera limits by entering this room, and is then moved over there. Is how that technically works. So, boom, boom, boom. That's how the camera functions. Next, I want to talk about the interaction components. So, what these are more collision shapes, as most of this works by. And this little icon to show that you are currently able to work with it. So, how this works. When on area entered, when the player enters this area here, this shows the icon to show that the player can interact with it, or that it is interactable. And now what happens is we tell the player, and we grab a signal in the player, and connect that to this method. And this method is connected to the parent object of the object we just interacted with. So if the player, let me move them down here for purposes. If the player goes over this object, you see it's now like this. And because they have, we have now connected the signal there, now the player has a signal connected to this specific object. So the player is now connected to this specific object through that signal. How that connection works is now if the player presses object interact key, which is E, it'll emit the signal, which then triggers this method, which then tells that object that we just connected to use their player object method. Now we discuss two types of objects that I have: pick-upable ones and static ones. So basically, I connect to this object and I give it player interaction. There are two ones: static ones that are meant to be picked up using the test object function. And the only static one I have right now are the ladders. So it's just scripted to work with ladders only. If that object is, if that number assigned is positive, it's a pickup. If it's negative, it's static. So first we'll cover the pickup objects. So, player clicks E, emits the signal, activates that object's player interaction. Oh, fuck, hold on. Forgot to loop the music. My bad. That messed me up. That object then is called on the test object, and they call their player interaction. So one more check to show that it's not static, and then emits that specific type, which one is assigned. So currently we're over the health jar, which is object type 2, and the coin bag is object type 1. So then it emits that, and then deletes that object, and tells that to the game manager. So so one more time, the player goes over an object and connects a signal between the player and the object. Now, if the player clicks object interact button, because the signal is connected, it activates this function, which of the connected object will go into it, and now the object will tell the game manager its object type. So, if that object type is 1, it will be increase the amount of gold the player has, and if the object type is 2, it will increase the player health. So now you see player health down here. If I click object interaction, it increases my health. Go to the gold, increases my gold. That's how object pickup works. This works nearly identically to the ladder for static objects. So now we just go back a few steps, and then it kind of functions a little differently. So we go over to the ladder, and you see this activates the same, but then it behaves differently because we're climbing the ladder and such. So what this does, instead of using the pickup, it uses activate. So player interaction, and it interacts with the ladder, which has the same named thing. And then the ladder, just like the pickable object, tells the game manager to do the function. So now we have that static ladder object, and what this effectively does, first, it tells the player they're climbing a ladder. So we go to the player, and they're being told to climb the ladder. So this becomes true, and this is the normal player's movement, and now the movement gets updated to work, to abide to the rules of the ladder. So now this effectively just forces the player to move up and down, and they can't go right or left, as long as they're climbing the ladder. Then it tells the ladder it's being climbed, the ladder script. What this does is change the hit limits of the ladder, the hitboxes for it. So normally, you see it's down here, but then once the ladder is being climbed, the top of the ladder will be moved up, is what the script does. So as you can see in the thing, we're on the ladder now, and we can't reach the top because the ladder knows it's being climbed. But then, once we get off, it goes back down, and we no longer just fall. Then go on again, we can now go down. That is how the ladder works. And then it just basically, when you want to get off the ladder, it just reverses the... So, like before, the ladder knows it's being climbed, true. Player is climbing the ladder, true. And then once we want to get off, we just do the same interact component function again, but this time it just reverses it, and player is now, because of the little knot here, reverses it and gets you off the ladder. So that's how the interact components function. Next, I want to talk more about the player themselves. We'll move them over here. And largely how the attack works, going up, attacking up and down, and the surface state here, as you see updates depending on what I'm on. So, run through the player script. You got your methods, your speed, you have basic stuff like gravity, movement. We discussed moving normally and then off the ladder or not, flipping the player sprite. And then two main things, this use of the sword and how that works with what I've labeled surface states. So effectively all this does is what this does is finds out what surface we're currently on. And how I have this tracked is through the surfaces here, which tells the player that surface state they're on. So we have custom data here, recording what surface type these things are on. So this normal ground we use is 1, this ladder is 0, the stairs are 2. We have that custom data on the tile set. Get surface state grabs that custom data of the surface type and tells the player what surface they're currently standing on. So what Get Surface State does is tells, okay, the player, it checks and it sees we're on one of the floor tiles. Then it updates, if we're on one of the stair tiles, it updates that. So now the game and the player knows whether they're on the stairs or the floor. Now, one thing that is currently doesn't work, that I have kind of scripted, but currently doesn't work, is whether the game knows you're on the ladder or not. But that's just one of the many unfinished parts. But for the floor and the stairs works. What that does is we need to track surface state because of attacking with the sword. Now, how do we know where to set the hitbox in the animation? Up or down? Well, with the surface state. Because normally you just attack forward, and then you attack up and down if you're on the stairs. So that's how that works. If you're on the stairs, if you're facing up, it'll have you attack up. If you're facing down, it'll attack down. Now, how does that work with the actual source move, the hitbox? Well, I use a animation player. So as you can see, this works with this sets the animation and sets the hitbox active. So we play the animation, as you see here. When we use the sword, we're not on the ladder, and the sword's off cooldown. If we're currently going up the stairs, that's set to the current animation and will swing upwards. And because we're going up the stairs, the hitbox is set to go up. Same for down. If we're currently going down the stairs, the hitbox is set to go down, and then when we press the button, it swings down. Otherwise, we just swing normally forward. Is how these two things work together. So we track surface state will always be tracking basically whether we're going up or down stairs or we're just on a normal surface, and where to put the sword swing because of that. Is how that works. Now, another kind of bug is whether you're like moving mid-swing, even though the swing's very short, it's still, you're not locked into that direction, is another thing that I would have added during that time. But with that is all of the functional parts of the game. The final thing that I was working on was this very unfinished part you can see, being enemy movement. I can just quickly showcase it here. Moving the camera back over. So, as you can see, oh, hold on. Frickin'. This is unassigned. Why is that? Okay, well, hold on, we'll just do it this way. I'll show you this way. Sorry. And then we'll move the player over here and reassign the camera to it. Oh, and then I have to activate the then I have to activate the collision shape. Just a little showcase of how that works. So you can see the enemy kind of moving down there pretty poorly looking at it, but it doesn't really work properly. If you notice during all this time, you see these array here like that. That's what this was as I was playtesting the bug fixing the enemy here. It's supposed to be moving between the two little blue things here, but it doesn't work. I can quickly show you the enemy script, but it is very unfinished. What it was meant to do is go between two little designated points, and then once it could once it could see the player, follow them until they're either killed or they lose sight of them, and then go back to like two positions. But I never got it to work, and that's basically when I got burned out. But that is basically all of these systems and all the work I did on this little Untitled game. I hope my explanations were understandable enough. Yeah, that's about it. Bye.